Hi, I'm Lisa, your DIY leader here at Leadership Reno. Welcome to this third module in the Leadership Reno, Becoming a Great Leader Masterclass series. If you haven't yet seen the first two modules of this series, visit my website at www.leadershipreno.com, then click on the Tools of the Trade option from the menu bar. On this page, you'll find all of the courses in this series, as well as some additional resources where you can get help. In this third module of the Masterclass series, we'll discuss how to transform your business by putting more women in charge. Our objectives are to differentiate between a toxic boss and a great leader. Explain the global pandemic of toxic bosses. Describe what leadership reform is and why we need it. Explain the paradigm shift required to solve for toxic bosses. Define the characteristics of a great leader. And suggest some tips and resources to help integrate leadership reform into your organization. Before I introduce you to today's special guest, I'd like to first explain what we mean by the term toxic boss. Then we'll compare that persona to that of what it takes to be a great leader. A toxic boss is someone in a leadership position who uses their authority to undermine their employees' happiness, success, and career growth. Self-centered and therefore makes decisions based on what will benefit them personally. Narcissistic or prone to narcissistic tendencies. A poor listener, lacks empathy and rules by creating fear in and intimidating others. Threatened by others' talents. A master at manipulation and untrustworthy. They're also proficient at managing up. They create an unhealthy atmosphere that results in low employee engagement and productivity and high turnover. And they're more likely to reward those who follow him or her without question. We'll discuss in more detail later how it's possible that these seemingly awful people somehow make it into management roles. However, for now, let me contrast those characteristics with the characteristics that make for a great leader. On the contrary, great leaders are those in a leadership position who use their authority to inspire the best in their employees. They're open to others' opinions and innovation. They're great listeners, prefer to do more listening than talking. They're encouraging of others' successes. They're empathetic, flexible, humble, and authentic. They're not afraid to admit when they're wrong. And they enjoy developing others' natural skills and abilities. Great leaders also provide their employees with growth opportunities. Aim to create more great leaders. And they create an atmosphere that results in high employee engagement and productivity, and low turnover. Their employees flourish. Now that we've defined what a toxic boss is versus a great leader, let me explain what I mean when I refer to a global pandemic of toxic bosses. The COVID-19 pandemic created new levels of stress in the world and in the workplace that we have not seen in recent times. The coffee shops that we used to hang out in were suddenly closed. We could no longer eat out in our favorite restaurants. Even fast food chains either closed or only offered drive-through services if they wanted to stay in business. Schools across the globe had to very quickly figure out ways to teach remotely. And for very young kids, that left parents in a terrible bind trying to figure out how to care for their kids when they could no longer attend school or daycare. An unprecedented number of businesses had to come up with work-from-home options, even in scenarios which had never before seemed feasible, like doctor's appointments where virtual visits became routine. Healthcare providers were suddenly overwhelmed with sick patients. Many of whom ended up in the emergency room because the virus impacted them much more severely due to other pre-existing conditions. And those who weren't sick were flocking to healthcare facilities to get vaccinated. While some businesses thrived during the worst of the pandemic, the majority of people suffered directly due to layoffs, declining productivity, and declining sales. Or they suffered indirectly due to the shortage in the supply chain and a lack of availability of everyday necessities. Many people were also suddenly faced with a backlog of unpaid bills. With global borders closing, workplaces shutting down and jobs being cut, workers' daily stresses reached a record high, increasing from 39% in 2019 to 43% in 2020. Who knows what the numbers will look like from 2021? The bottom line is that an increase in toxic bosses leads to a decrease in employee engagement. According to Gallup, the decrease in employee engagement was 2% last year. This equates to $8.1 trillion in cost to the global economy. That is an astonishing amount of money toxic bosses are costing the global workforce. When employees are not engaged, not only does their interest in work decrease, but so does their productivity, which all contributes to that $8.1 trillion number. But there is a solution. And that is what I call leadership reform. Leadership reform means redefining the traits used to hire and select people leaders, reestablishing the expectations of people leaders, and redefining the metrics used to evaluate people leaders. According to Gallup, employee motivation and engagement is often made or broken through their managers. We'll talk more about each of those components throughout this course. First, let's do a quick recap before joining our special guest. Okay, so we've differentiated between the traits of a toxic boss versus a great leader, and we've discussed why we're seeing an increase in the number of toxic bosses and what we mean by leadership reform. Let's head up to the rooftop deck to meet our special guest and talk about the paradigm shift we're suggesting. Welcome to the rooftop deck here at Leadership Reno. I'm here today with my friend and very special guest, Dr. Tomas Chamorro Premuzic. Dr. Tomas was the very first member of my leadership reform squad. I'm excited to share his knowledge with you all. Before I let Dr. Tomas introduce himself further, I have to share with you his website at www.drtomas.com. On his website, you'll find information about the numerous books he's written as well as the over 150 psychology papers and articles on the psychology of talent, leadership, innovation, and AI. His work has been featured in publications such as Harvard Business Review, The Guardian, and Forbes. His commercial work focuses on science-based tools that improve organizations' ability to predict performance and people's ability to understand themselves. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Tomas. I am so excited you're here.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm happy to be here.
This course is based on Dr. Tomas's book titled, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders, and How to Fix It. That's quite a provocative title for a book, Dr. Tomas. However, I know the name is definitely what caught my eye at first. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how this book came about?
Sure. No problem. That was definitely my intention when coming up with the book title. Now, a bit more about me. I was born in Buenos Aires, but have spent most of my career in London. I currently call New York my home, where I am Chief Innovation Officer at Manpower Group, Professor of Business Psychology at University College London and Columbia University. My expertise covers two broad areas of psychology, business psychology and consumer psychology. It's my work in business psychology, however, that led me to write the book you just mentioned.
And you start your book off in chapter 1 with some interesting numbers. You mention that Gallup states that 75% of people quit their jobs because of their direct manager, which basically means that bad leadership is the number one reason for voluntary turnover worldwide. And that 65% of Americans say they would rather change their boss than get a pay increase.
Which could be a bit short-sighted because there's no guarantee that the next boss will be any better. However, these numbers were intriguing to me, so I dug further to better understand that mentality. My book is the result of that research.
In your book, you start off by exploring the statistics around female CEOs in S&P 500 companies, and found that even though our global population is roughly 50% male and 50% female, of these S&P 500 companies' female representation in leadership roles was nowhere near those numbers, with 36% in low to mid-level management roles, 25% in senior leadership roles, 20% in board member roles, and only 6% at the CEO level. And if those numbers represent S&P 500 companies, which are more likely to make a conscious effort to ensure the diversity of their workforce, I can only imagine that the rest of the world's representation of women in leadership roles is much less.
Right. That is the phenomenon that led me to write this book. You see, the underrepresentation of women in leadership is not due to their lack of ability or motivation, but rather society's inability to recognize incompetence in men.
How do you know that?
Dr. Alice Eagley, a professor at Northwestern University, and her colleagues did a review of 45 studies on leadership and gender, and found that women were more able to drive positive change in their teams and organizations than men were. Not least was because of their leadership strategies. Specifically, women elicit more respect and pride from their followers, communicate their vision more effectively, approach problem solving in a more flexible and creative way, and are fairer and more objective in their evaluation of their direct reports. Not only that, women have to work harder and longer to get to the top than men, which is why there are not more of them at the top. And they are often more knowledgeable and qualified than their male counterparts. Men, on the other hand, were found to be less likely to connect with their subordinates or reward them for actual performance. They also tend to focus less on developing others and more on advancing their own career agenda.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that women make better people leaders, and that we need to rethink the traits, characteristics, and metrics that we use to hire, select, and measure our people leaders?
Right. Leadership is a resource for the organization, good only if employees benefit from it by increased motivation and performance. Even though women naturally meet more of the criteria that equates to better people leaders, elevating the standards of leadership should be the goal, regardless of male or female. We need to replace our flawed evaluation criteria for leaders across the board and use more effective criteria that predicts actual performance.
That explains the paradigm shift we discussed earlier. We need to hire more women as people leaders.
Not only that, we need to apply these same traits when hiring men as people leaders as well.
But once we hire the right people leaders, we can't stop there, right?
Exactly. It doesn't do any good just to hire what we think are the right people. We also have to continue to monitor and evaluate them to ensure they do actually perform as we think they will.
We touched on engagement surveys in the first video of this series.
Right. So, let's take a deeper dive into the subject of employee engagement surveys so that we can explain the relevancy in this instance.
Okay. According to Gallup, the definition of employee engagement is the involvement and enthusiasm of employees in both their work and workplace. 6 important things to know about employee engagement surveys. They should be administered and the results evaluated by a third party. This is the only way to ensure the employees feel comfortable enough to be transparent with their answers and ensure their identity is protected. Next, it is recommended that these surveys be conducted annually. Results are often provided with year-over-year comparisons, which is important to allow for remediation or improvements. Speaking of remediation, each company should have a predetermined method of remediation depending on each people leader's score. Remediation can be anything from attending training classes, to working with an executive coach, to reassigning the offender to an individual contributor role so they are not negatively impacting employee engagement. Employee engagement surveys should be mandated, as much as reasonable. They should not, however, be incentivized for completion as this can impact the results. Next, employee engagement surveys should be taken seriously. This includes requiring managers to evaluate their results, share them with their team, and document an action plan for areas of improvement. Lastly, it's important to know that many employee engagement surveys not only include questions about employees' direct managers, but also categories such as corporate culture, executive leadership, personal development, and so on. Employee engagement surveys are a great way to give employees a voice and hold leaders accountable.
I agree. Both of which, if done properly, can improve a company's overall culture and performance.
Okay, that explains the paradigm shift required to solve for toxic bosses. We have to give employees a voice to fairly represent their honest opinions, and redefine the characteristics used to select and evaluate people leaders. Which brings us to our next objective, which is to define what characteristics we should be looking for, to ensure that we're hiring and promoting great leaders, and why we should see more women in these roles as a result. In your book, you have a great table in there that lists the common misperceptions of what makes a great leader, versus the reality of what makes a great leader based on the scientific data.
Yes. And the differences are very important here. Looking at the 5 aspects of a leader that were evaluated, the perception of the definition, goals, performance, and attributes of a leader are obviously much more leader-centric than the reality. When you look at the evidence based on the data, it's clear that great leaders are very focused on the success of their employees and the success of the team as a whole. It's about building up others. And that's something women are naturally good at.
I'd also like to point out again that the evidence confirms that confidence and charisma are not indicators or requirements of a great leader, but rather integrity and competence. And I'm going to add in humility as evidence-based criteria for great leaders. It's been proven time and time again that this is an aspect of some of our greatest leaders throughout history. It's also a personal observation and something I practice as well with my team that has proven successful for me.
Agreed. I'd rather have a competent surgeon than a confident or charismatic surgeon.
Yes. And charisma is in the eye of the beholder, as they say. So, that can't possibly be a character trait that can be measured accurately. Why do we keep selecting these type of people as leaders then?
As a society, we are hardwired to search for superheroes over glorifying leaders who exude charisma.
That makes sense. Okay. I've broken down what's in your book and combined it with my methodology and grouped the characteristics into 6 key categories. Let's review those now. The first characteristic of a great leader is humility. By that we mean someone who is modest and not proud or arrogant. This characteristic is exhibited by not being afraid to admit mistakes or shortcomings, being open to others' opinions, and being willing to learn. The next characteristic that great leaders must have is integrity, which means they have soundness of their moral character. This characteristic is exhibited by being sensitive to the cultural norms of the organization, being honest, and being trusting and trustworthy.
Right. This is an important differentiation from leaders who micromanage their team due to their own insecurities.
I agree. Most people won't tolerate that type of hyper-oversight for very long, which ultimately results in turnover. Okay. The third characteristic that we should be looking for in selecting people leaders is authenticity. This is defined as someone who is genuine and real. They should be competent and actually be able to walk the talk. Meaning, there should be a depth of knowledge in their subject area that goes beyond surface level. Authenticity is a big one for me, because this is where you can differentiate those who can, versus those who just know how to speak as if they can.
Exactly. Those who cannot back up their words with actual skills are the literal embodiment of the term imposter syndrome.
All right. Getting back to our list. We should also be looking for people who are inspirational. Great people leaders should be able to influence their employees in a good way and compel them to action. They need to be able to inspire their team to do their best work, communicate and implement their vision in a way that motivates their team, and act as a positive role model. Next on our list is selfless. This is defined as someone who has little or no concern for themselves. A selfless people leader recognizes their employees for their accomplishments, gives credit where credit is due, and genuinely enjoys their employees' successes. They want to see their employees do well. And finally, we should be looking for people leaders who are empathetic. This is defined as the psychological identification of the thoughts and feelings of others. Leaders who have this characteristic are good listeners and good at identifying and nurturing their employees' goals and potential. In summary, to ensure we're hiring and selecting great people leaders, we should be looking for people who have humility, integrity and authenticity and are inspirational, selfless and empathetic. It sounds like we're basically talking about emotional intelligence here, or EQ.
Yes. Emotional intelligence, or emotional quotient, also called EQ, is the ability to perceive and manage emotions. People with high EQ can recognize their own emotions and those of others and use this information to guide their thinking and behavior. Women naturally have higher EQs.
That makes perfect sense. Someone with a higher EQ is more in tune to their own feelings and those of others, which is also helpful with having an unconscious confrontation with someone. We discussed this in depth in our last module in this series, Module 2, Dissolving Bullying in the Workplace. So, how do we solve for the toxic bosses who are currently in people leader roles?
There's no quick and easy answer. Many toxic bosses will cycle out of their roles organically due to obvious reasons. Ironically, as long as a boss has little to do with their employees, they probably won't do much damage. However, it's up to CEOs and senior executives to make a conscious effort to implement this type of transformation.
Okay, so, we've now also covered the characteristics we should be looking for when hiring, selecting, and evaluating people leaders. Now we just need to provide some tips and resources to help our learners integrate leadership reform into their organizations. First, every company should invest in hiring a third party to implement annual employee engagement surveys if you don't already have one. If you do have one in place, re-emphasize the importance of these surveys moving forward. Take action on the results and hold people leaders accountable. Next, organizations need to revisit hiring practices for people leaders. Stop hiring for charisma, confidence, and humor. Instead, include assessments that evaluate EQ and incorporate standard interview questions that are scaled to evaluate candidates for humility, integrity, authenticity, inspiration, selflessness, and empathy. Be open to hiring more women. Third, organizations need to revisit performance metrics used to evaluate people leaders. Include employee engagement survey results as a metric that leaders are held accountable for in their annual reviews. Include employee turnover as a metric for people leaders, and consider using 360-degree reviews for people leaders to obtain feedback from direct reports. Lastly, companies need to invest in proper, ongoing management training programs. Managers need to be able to inspire their employees to do their best work. This includes the emotional intelligence required to ask great questions, listen to individuals' personal goals, and use employee strengths to drive engagement and produce measurable business outcomes. Investing in ongoing, robust manager training programs results in a return on investment that far exceeds the cost involved.
Great people leaders are an unstoppable force. They attract, engage, and keep workers even in this extremely competitive marketplace. They can even rally employees to push the organization forward in times of disruption.
Thank you, Dr. Tomas, for your insight and dedication to improving the level of leaders everywhere.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
For more help, you can email DIYleader@leadershipreno.com to request a transcript of this course. Visit Dr. Tomas's website to learn more about his book and body of work. And lastly, visit my website for more tools and resources. Thank you for watching this course. Check out our website for the entire selection of courses in this series.